Good evening and welcome to the last session of this Jewish Book Week. I'm Nicholas Safar, Chairman of the New Israel Fund UK, and we're the sponsors of this evening's event. I won't take any more of your time except to say thank you particularly Jewish Book Week for keeping open house on so much lively debate. There are two organisations in this country that manage to do that for the Jewish community, and Book Week is truly a very important series of events for the whole Jewish community. I'm going to pass over to Jonathan Friedland.
Yes, I think I will.
I'm going to pass over to Jonathan Friedland, who will introduce the panel, and I guess let proceedings commence. Jonathan.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you very much. So yes, my name is Jonathan Friedland. I write for the Jewish Chronicle. Usually I can be relied on to get some boos or hisses for either one of those, depending which audience we're facing. Maybe we'll get both this evening. But Jewish Book Week regular, I'm very glad to be here. It is an honour, really, to be given this closing session, but I think it's for a topic that is one that exercises a lot of people and everyone here. And what we're going to hope to do is to have really a very frank and candid discussion, both here, but then to widen it out and take questions, contributions, etc., as we can from out there. Let me say two things about the evening before I introduce our panel and get really stuck in. Unusually, this is a debate which has prompted a debate before it's even started. So there has been a flurry of discussion from people saying, well, what kind of discussion is this? All the people represented on the panel are broadly on the kind of left of the Israel question, and therefore it's not really a debate. So what I would say about that is that if you have that view, don't blame the people up here. It's not their fault. They were invited and said yes. If you have an issue with that, maybe talk to the organisers of Jewish Book Week about other events that ran through the week where I would say other views were represented, or even what happens in future. In other words, don't blame the people here for holding the views they had. That's the idea. Second, in defence of that idea, I would say that sometimes there are things you can explore and get into when you are away from the usual ding-dong of back and forth, left and right. Sometimes there are nuances and differences that are themselves worth teasing out, and you can get a discussion when you do that. The other element of discussion was about and just to show you how sensitive this whole area is, about the promotional blurb for the event that appears in your Jewish Book Week programme and elsewhere, particularly this line: while a peaceful solution remains as elusive as ever, the debate rages on, polarised between those offering unconditional support and those labelled self-hating Jews for their criticism of Israeli government policy, etc., etc. Now, a lot of people said, so one of the Jewish Book Week is saying those are the only two positions possible. Either you give unconditional support for Israel, or you're a self-hating Jew. Either you're a self-hating Jew, or, as if to say everyone who isn't in the self-hating Jew category, they only give unconditional support. Everybody was offended by that. So people who are critical said, what, now you're calling me a self-hating? And other people said, what, you're saying that I'm only unconditional and I'm somehow blind. Everyone managed to be offended by that sentence. I would say the key word in the sentence is polarised. What was meant by the two extreme poles in this caricature, one group polarised and caricatured as self-hating, one group polarised and caricatured as giving unconditional support, and of course there are thousands and tens of thousands of opinions in between. So that's just to clarify all of that. And just to show you this self-hating thing has some traction, I'm glad to say this event has been the subject of a blog, several in fact, including one by Yisrael Meidad, who is a settler, a blogger who lives in a settlement in Samaria, Israel. I'm just showing you that I'm equal. I'm reading about how he defines himself. And I was also just about to say, just to show you I'm impeccably even-handed. That's how I'm describing his own life. And he says, debate between whom? Between what opposing views? All three are far left. For sure, though, a good collection of self-hating Jews. He said all three, so I'm okay. That's how I'm taking that. So, controversy before we've... Let's introduce properly our panel. Three people with very different histories, vantage points, involvement in this subject. On my right, Francesca Klug is regarded by many as perhaps the leading legal scholar in the country on human rights. professor and director of the Human Rights Futures Project, a prime mover behind the Human Rights Act, which is now part of the law of the land in this country, has been involved in activities one way or the other in this area, but crucially for our purposes, was one of the founding signatories of Independent Jewish Voices, or IJV. Not speaking in any way on their behalf, purely here to represent herself, but that is part of the background. On my immediate left, Daniel Levy, known to many of you partly for his initial leadership work in the country, that being a long time ago, moved on to Israel. We're very involved in a hands-on way in the peace process, part of the negotiating team through several years of the Oslo and post-Oslo process, worked at one time at the hand of Yossi Beilin, now sits in New York, but works out of Washington, D.C., involved in the Next Century Foundation, or the Century Foundation, and the New America Foundation, particularly running their Prospects for Peace peace in the Middle East. And he would be too modest to say so, but I think it's absolutely fair to say one of the voices in Washington that is most listened to on the politics of the peace process, and many people in the administration and around it read what Daniel writes and listen to what he says, and no one could really be more plugged in. And finally, on the far left, as far as I'm concerned, sitting here, purely physically, of course, Professor David Newman from Ben Gurion University in Israel, Israel proper, I will now say, to balance my own. Edits the international journal Geopolitics, has written extensively on the politics of borders, not just in the Middle East, but all around the world, and has come to attention, perhaps to people here, the land of his birth more recently, for controversial stands he's taken in some ways on two different elements of the debate, perhaps some might even say different sides of the debate. A leading activist and campaigner in the campaign against an academic boycott of Israel, and simultaneously one of the loudest, most effective voices in the campaign for human rights and against many of the policies that are pursued by current and past Israeli governments. So that is our panel. As I say, very well placed indeed to debate all these things. We are going to talk a lot, I think, about, there'll be some about what's actually going on in Israel and Israel-Palestine at the moment. But I really want us to get into the debate and how that debate is conducted and how we can do it. Three people, as I said, who've got experiences. I want to start off by asking whether any of you recognise any restrictions at all on this debate. In other words, some people believe there are certain opinions which should be off limits and restricted as being illegitimate. There is no place in the debate for people who believe X. And I just want to start with three of you. Given the way you've been caricatured in some ways, people would be surprised if you did believe there were any legitimate restrictions. So David Newman, why don't you kick us off? Are there any restrictions you yourself would, who has got a right to take part in this debate?
I don't know whether there are restrictions on who has the right to take part in the debate, providing people don't promote racism or instant hatred, then everyone has a right to take part in debate. I know who I have a problem debating with. I have on my own side of the political spectrum, I'm not talking about the other side of the political spectrum, I certainly would draw my own borders between who are critical of Israeli government policy, critical of occupation, and those who delegitimize the whole existence of the State of Israel. Now, I don't say those people don't have a right to make their statement, but I think in the wider debate about what is good in the long term, then I think the issue of completely delegitimizing the State of Israel, saying it's born out of sin, that sort of argument, I have a problem. And I think the fact that the borders are so tenuous between the different positions, I think by including that in part of the debate, that is where you are opening yourself for all the people on the right to come and say, oh, these anti-Zionists, these Jewish self-haters, and so on. So there is a point there where I would say, again, I don't say it's an illegitimate position, but it's a very difficult debate. You're talking about two very different...
The word you've used of delegitimization, that's going to be a word that I think is going to be kicked around a lot, and is kicked around a lot. Just unpack for us what that word is, rather than just, does it just translate as strongly disagree with?
No,
I delegitimize you. Is that really much more than I really just very strongly disagree?
No, it's a lot more than strongly disagreeing. It's more or less saying that you are not legitimate. You don't have a right to open your mouth. You are illegitimate. You shouldn't be there. You're not part of the debating you're not part of the discourse out there at all. And in the past few years, I'm aware of it as an academic at Israeli universities. I'm aware of it as a person who's actually become re-involved in much of the discourse within the British Jewish community. There are attempts out there to completely silence people and by using this term, by delegitimizing them, saying they are not of any worth, therefore they should not be part of the debate.
Okay, I want to definitely drill down further into that. But Francesca, what about you? Are there any limits you would recognise as, to use the word of the hour, as legitimate, lines that you yourself would draw?
Well, as someone who works in human rights, and that's my focus, you would expect me to say what I'm going to say, which is that, no, I don't think anyone should ever be barred from any debate, certainly a debate about a state, any state. But I do think there are limits about how you debate. And I am sometimes taken aback at the way that this debate seems to take place. And I don't just mean me, I mean wherever I come across it. There are obviously extremely strong emotions involved in this issue. But I think that we're all capable of keeping control of our emotions and discussing issues with respect for people we disagree with. I mean, I mainly come across this issue actually not in the Jewish world, but in the human rights world, which includes a lot of Jewish people that I operate in. And I'm often most uncomfortable actually with people who enter this debate without any sense and respect of the peoples involved in this debate. And most commonly actually in my working life, what I find is there are a lot of people who are not Jewish or not familiar with the Jewish story who talk about this as if it is another example simply of colonialism and an oppressed people. And I feel very uncomfortable about that because I think that it doesn't take a lot of knowledge to know that this doesn't fold into that story. So this is a different kind of story. So I'm often uncomfortable with that, yes. But I don't think it gives me any grounds to rant and rave or insult my opponents.
Sure, but let's say there is such a person who does see it through that colonialism prism that you've just set out, and says, perhaps in the way that David was describing, the state of Israel is illegitimate and was from its birth, it was born in sin, etc. Would you say, okay, you could be on a platform in a debate with them, discussing with them, you wouldn't feel as if that's actually just too far?
I don't understand why it wouldn't be, because we're talking about a state. And all states around the world, many states around the world, you get differences of opinion, very strongly held. Think of closer to home, think of Northern Ireland, you know. I've been on a platform with both sides of that debate in Northern Ireland. I can't think of people who have more polarised views. But of course they have to be part of the debate precisely because they have those polarised views.
Okay.
I think there's a difference between delegitimizing human beings and their right to exist and delegitimizing states. And one feels very strongly about it on either side, but you have to allow that debate to take place.
Plenty of people who are in the other side of the argument would say to say that Israel is an illegitimate state, and nobody ever did say this about Britain, even however heated they got it about Northern Ireland, they never said Britain shouldn't exist. You know. But true, they did say about United Kingdom should be reconvened. But a lot of people hear in that a kind of statement about the legitimacy of Jews to exist. They hear in that you can't live the way everyone else lives.
That's the problem, and that's why I have most difficulty with people in my world who don't recognise the sensitivity around that. But that's not the same thing to say the debate to have about a state. Of course there is. A state that's 60 years old, of course there is.
So let's come to you, Daniel Levy. What's helpful in a way is Francesca lives and works here, David lives and works in Israel, you have experience of Britain and Israel, but now mainly operate in the United States. So I'm just giving us a flavour, if you can, of the debate there, as you see it, but particularly from this angle that I'm putting to the others. Are there any restrictions, limitations, legitimacies that you yourself would say, or even work, where you don't cross that line, you're not seen with this person, you don't debate with that person?
Well, first, if I may, I'd just like to thank Jewish Book Week for hosting this, this session, and I'd like to thank the New Israel Fund. Ordinarily, it would be an honour to be on a platform in an event hosted by the New Israel Fund. In the particular circumstances we find ourselves in, I'm particularly honoured and grateful that the New Israel Fund put this together.
You see, of the three of us, he's the politician of the future.
Absolutely.
What I was going to say was that you can tell he's been in America a while. Exactly what I was going to say, but that's. But I think we've got the same point in mind.
Apropos being in America for a while, I grew up where it was the right thing to do on campus to run no platform for racist and fascist campaigns.
Right.
And I still can't adapt in the US to the idea of the absolute right to free speech, First Amendment, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm still trying to adapt to that. Let me try and come at this from the following angle. I think, first, the means of debate in the US are very different. In a way, because Israel is so accepted, that almost has a liberating effect. It's easier to debate about it because the very existence and acceptance of Israel is less under rigorous questioning. Let me step back from the US for a second, with your permission. Undoubtedly, there are those who are involved in this debate who take their opposition to Israel's legitimacy and existence to a place that endangers Jewish Israelis by crossing a line that incites violence against Israel and Jewish Israelis. I would argue that that is by no means the majority of the detractors of Israel or Israeli policy. And I think what gives them juice, what gives them appeal, what begins to make that argument mainstream is the iniquities of the occupation. And so I would always say, do better policy, not better hasbara, not better PR. That's where it all has. That's also true. That's also true for some within the Jewish community who are critics of Israel. But I would take a slightly different position, perhaps from something that David articulated. It's very, I think, very ahistorical in Jewish life, certainly in post-Haskalah, post-emancipation Jewish life, to have one legitimate ideology which we all have to adhere to and nothing else is okay. And I would urge cautioning a state, which is kind of something that Francesca said. Zionism, the establishment of the State of Israel, was about addressing a Jewish question under particular historical circumstances. Zionism became a majoritarian trend in Jewish life post-Shoah. My own Zionism, look, is there legitimacy to the United Kingdom? It's connected to a colonial act in Ireland. Was there a legitimacy to dispossessing Aborigines in Australia, Native Americans, etc.? I, as someone who comes from a Jewish perspective, have made my peace with what happened in 47 to 49. And can call myself a Zionist. My vision of what needs to happen after that, what needs to happen today, is very different. I, by the way, do not expect everyone else, and certainly not Palestinians, to make their peace with what happened from 47 to 49. As a collective national movement, I expect them to be able to sign up to certain arrangements if dignified arrangements are put on the table. The place where my comfort zone is tested and I get antsy is the following. Israel is home to the first or second, depending on whose numbers you look at, largest Jewish community in the world today. And someone who is hostile or indifferent to the physical well-being, but not just the physical well-being, the spiritual and moral well-being of Israel's Jewish community, that's a place that, for me, crosses the comfort zone. So for me, it's all intimacy of the debate inside the Jewish community is... If you look at this, and every time you hear something terrible has happened in Israel, we've kicked Palestine, Jerusalem, Ethiopian kids are blocked from going to a school in Petah Tikva, we treat refugee asylum seekers from Eritrea in a certain way. If it's a gotcha moment for you, if it's what in Hebrew we would call simcha la'ed, the joy of witnessing this happening, you're not in my camp. You're not part of my conversation. For me, it's painful because this is about what's happening to the largest or second largest Jewish community in the world.
Okay, several things to follow up. One, I want to follow up with you, and then to the others. When camp. Now, is that an emotional or almost moral point that you're making, which is because you have this kind of gloating attitude to, Israel wrongdoing, perhaps, and you somehow are not sensitive to the needs of the Jews, therefore, in principle, I can't talk with you and you're not in my camp? Or is it somehow tactical that somebody like you, who's there advocating change for Israel, would worry that if you were associated with people who are unsympathetic, somehow were tainted by association, that's just bad politics for you, and therefore you think, okay, I won't actually be on a platform with person X, they might discredit my dissenting position on Israel, or is it actually a principled sort of moral stance? I can't talk with them, they're across the line.
From a conversation within the confines of the Jewish world, what's the next steps in terms of the historical juncture that we find ourselves in inside world Jewry? I'm saying you're not in that conversation. I'm not saying you can stay out of the entire, you have to stay out of the entire conversation, but you're not part of that conversation. It's not a conversation I expect non-Jews to be part of, for instance. Sure, one makes a lot of tactical decisions in terms of who one's seen with, who one shares a platform with, who one co-authors with. Something, by the way, very interesting going on in Israel right now. I don't know how closely people are following the incidents in Sheikh Jarrah, in this place where several Palestinians were evicted from their homes. There's an interesting alliance being formed between non-Zionist, non-Jews, non-Zionist Jews, overtly Zionist Jews, David Grossman there, Moshe Halbertal, Ron Pundak, for those of you who follow kind of Israeli developments more closely. And they're saying, no, in these should be seen together. We're all going to pay a price for being seen together, but the conditions right now demand it.
Thank you. You moved seamlessly between two different categories there, which is what you don't expect of Palestinians in terms of their view of 47-49, and then other Jews. And I'm just interested to know whether these categories of legitimacy and illegitimacy, are they ethnic blind, if you like? In other words, what views people hold, it doesn't make any difference to you, whether they're Jewish or not Jewish. There's just a certain... Are there certain things Jews can say about Israel which still keep them within the legitimate fold of a discussion, that if the non-Jew was to say the same thing, I can't talk to them? Francesca, let's hear from you on that, and then...
Well, it'd be helpful to have an illustration, but I think I know what you're talking about.
Well, let's say somebody says, I think the state of Israel is illegitimate, it was from the beginning, colonial project, born in sin, should never have happened, but they're Jewish, and somebody says the same things, and isn't.
Huge difference to me. I think that, look, what is all this about? We're trying to... There's a vexed issue in the world in Palestine. It's not the only place in Palestine and Israel. And it needs to be resolved for the sake of all of us in the world. Therefore, discourse and debate about it, as far as I'm concerned, is to that end. If somebody, whether they're Jewish or not Jewish, whoever they are, is disrespecting of the history, that situation that we're in now, to the situation we're in now, then they're not going to help resolve it. Right. And they're not going to enlighten us to understand it. And therefore, it doesn't much matter to me who is expressing views that is not respecting of the tragic history that led to two peoples fighting over this land. That's the important issue for me, is to empathise and respect, and then we have to think how to resolve it.
And if somebody cannot do that, would you say they're not a legitimate participant?
No, well, legitimate is not part of my language, but I would find it uncomfortable to be agreeing with them about a resolution, even if I did agree with them about a resolution. Because I wouldn't feel confident that they had the best interests of all the people who are living in that land at heart.
And that knits together with what Daniel's saying.
It does, really.
It is now the largest or second largest Jewish
does, really.
So let's make it tangible. John Pilger, no friend of Israel, was writing in the New Statesman recently and quoted somebody who said that what Israeli governments are doing confirms the worst stereotypes of the Jews, that they're greedy and they kill children. And he quoted as well, the same person actually, saying, this reminds me very much of what the Jews did in the Holocaust. Now, the person he quoted was Rami Elchanan. Well, sorry, what the Jews did. No, what we're doing to the Palestinians reminds me of what happened to the Jews in the Holocaust. And then the person who was quoted actually turns out to be, I've forgotten his name, I think it's Rami Elchanan, whose daughter died. In other words, Israeli, Jewish, and his daughter died in a suicide bombing several years ago. Now, I read that and thought, if himself about particularly the lines of anti-Semitism, etc., there would have been huge fury and uproar and people would say the New Statesman should never have published it, etc. Because he quoted an Israeli, a Jew, and a bereaved parent, it was very difficult to know where to go with that in terms of saying whether that was legitimate or not. So there's a specific for you, David. Just sort of walk us through where you would... Because you yourself said you had discomfort.
Before I get to that, I'm going through the politician now, and I have to take Daniel up on something he said at the end, because while I was waiting for my plane this morning at Ben Gurion Airport, in much warmer weather than I got to London, I spoke to my son, who's just recently finished 4 years of army service and is now a law and philosophy student at the Hebrew University. And he went to the demonstration in Sheikh Jarrah last night. And I got a first-hand account of what went on there. And so, in one sense, you're right. You know, you had...
Maybe you just could tell people in a sentence what the issue is.
What's happening in Sheikh Jarrah, which is, of course, in East Jerusalem, is that the Jerusalem municipality, under its new mayor, he's been there a year and a bit now, right of centre, which is reflective of the Jewish population residing in Jerusalem, has decided to evict a significant number of Palestinian residents of that area and turn it into a nice green area of park, etc., etc., more for the use of the Jewish residents of the region, but even if it was for the use of anyone, it wouldn't really make a great deal of difference. There's a great deal of opposition, of course, obviously amongst the entire Palestinian population, and amongst certain sectors or large sectors, let's call them left of the Israeli Jewish population. My son described to me this morning, he said, first of all, unfortunately, as is reflective of the left in Israel today, it wasn't a 400,000 demonstration, there were a few hundred people there. And he said you could define three groups. He said you could define Palestinians, you could define radical, well, he used the term radical, people who, let's say, are critical or what you defined as non-Zionist of the state, and the classic Zionist piece. Actually, there were huge tensions at the demonstration because the Meretz people came along. Meretz, who, you know, when you're looking at it from the centre or the right, are considered the radical left. They, last night, were considered to be the radical centrists and rights, and they were being criticised for raising the Israeli flag at the demonstration. I mean, I think that's very typical of one of the big problems that we have generally in getting out the sort of centre-left message today. I'm self-critical of, so I'm critical of others because I'm one of these people. I think we get too tied up in our intellectual arguments. We're very good at writing op-eds and at using the words. The other side are much better in actions. And we, because of our, in a sense, intellectual, what shall I call it, feeling of superiority, whether that's there or not, we tend to get very tied up on the internal schisms and ideological divisions. And today there isn't a left-wing peace camp in Israel, because it's totally fragmented. It fell away completely at last elections. And if we want discourse and on the debate, and I'm sorry I've taken you away in a different direction, we have to completely reinvent the left in Israel, because it just doesn't exist today.
Well, you haven't taken me away at all, because this is, in a way, the exact area I was keen to move to, which is where the, you know, and left is a very blunt instrument to be deploying here as a label. But those voices who are critical, dissenting, who do want some change in Israel, let's just make it practical and concrete just a bit, and some personal experience. We're taking it as read that there are these efforts to push to legitimize, close down, silence, whatever words you want to use. Let's just make that real, first of all, so with experiences of that. So, Daniel, you've operated in 3 different contexts. Are there experiences you've had where people have tried to say, because of the views you hold, you are somehow across a line, beyond the pale, I shouldn't be talking to? You or groups you're involved with?
Groups I've been involved with. So, I have been called names in the blogosphere, and that's fine. One naturally develops a thick skin. I have not. I feel I've, relatively speaking, compared to others, been treated somewhat with kid gloves. I think, you know, having moved to Israel and done what I did there, gives one a certain insulation.
I think it's partly because you are able to say what you said earlier, which is to say, you know, defined in your own terms, but yes, I am a Zionist, and therefore, does that in some way insulate you from some criticism people might get if they weren't ready to sign up to that statement?
I'd say yes, and it shouldn't. I mean... It
shouldn't give you that protection?
No. Yeah, exactly. It shouldn't... I mean, that for me, that shouldn't be the boundary. Nature Carter. Do they belong, ultra-orthodox or anti-Zionist, from a theological reading of Jewish law? I think not having a Zionist position, if one is coming from a Jewish place and one is concerned about the Jewish future, is legitimate. The reality is that most of Britain's Jewish community, America's Jewish community, haven't gone there. We need to define, these terms have become ossified. over 60 years, and it's not a healthy contributor to a debate to go there. So I'll leave it.
I'm very happy to give you. Francesca, I know you you don't speak for that group in any way, but you were a signatory to Independent Jewish Voices, IJV. This comes up a lot where I hear it often, where people talk about people to invite on a panel and they'll say, we can't have them, they're an IJVer, as if that is beyond the pale, that's across a certain line. But you must have some experience of that, and if you have, it will be good and useful for you to share it.
I've been blessedly protected from a lot of this, and I don't know whether I'm about to have a baptism of fire tonight. I'm told by my daughter, because her and her friend were Googling my name a few months ago, and apparently, along with my brothers, I'm on the Jewish shit list, which stands for self-hating. I can't remember what IMT stands for.
Join the family.
Yes, I think I sort of wore it as a badge of pride. I mean, I've thought about it quite a bit since, because self-hating isn't a phrase I particularly don't identify with. There are things about myself that I've never been very comfortable with, and I could be persuaded, in fact, to wear the label of self-hating. But one thing it doesn't apply to is being Jewish. It's something I feel really good about and have all my life, and want to go on feeling good about. I have to say that in my work, I've had far more abuse from the ultra-right than I've had from this world. I've been targeted...
Nothing to do with the Israel-Palestine?
Well, no, but as a Jew working in human rights, I've been targeted by the ultra-right for years. I have these letters, I have PhD theses sent to me, which is about and I receive tales of the Holocaust regularly. I get letters saying that why weren't you all gassed in Auschwitz? And eventually I ended up in a case in Leeds Crown Court, which someone told me has now been written up, and it says Francesca Clark giving evidence about the tales of the Holocaust, the tales of the Holocaust, which was sort of Alice in Wonderland, being gassed. You know, if you work in human rights or anything similar, you just have to accept that this is part of the deal. Hurl abuse at you, and I think that, frankly, compared to the price people are paying all around the world, including in Israel and Palestine, standing up for their beliefs, it is not a very big deal.
Okay, I definitely want you to come back. I was just going to... There we are. I was just going to offer the Larry David response to the accusation of being a self-hating Jew, which is, I do hate myself, but it's nothing to do with being Jewish. Which I think is very, it's very useful.
Absolutely.
It's very, very useful in this context.
Me.
But before you weigh in, because Daniel mentioned it, but it's absolutely in the air in this evening. This evening is sponsored by the New Israel Fund. The New Israel Fund doing all its work, funding groups who are involved in social justice in Israel, branded in an advertisement taken out in the Jerusalem Post and other papers, the president of the New Israel Fund depicted with a horn coming out of her head, Naomi Chazan, and branded very much self-hating Jews for their role, the New Israel Fund's role, indirectly, its grantees, recipients of funds, having lent assistance, given information that was used ultimately in the Goldstone report. So, and this became and is an ongoing row. But you may take that as your example, but can you give us other examples where you yourself have been on the receiving end of somebody saying Newman is now illegitimate or delegitimized because of this view?
Well, I suppose some people here may have read The Observer a few months ago, when Ned Temko reported an issue where I received some very pleasant emails from a member of the British Jewish community. I'm trying to be polite when I report this. I think he wished me dead, and in the other one he says, you know, I hope that you perish from the face of the earth, and I will do everything to get your university to remove you, ta-da-da-da-da. I'm happy to say, by the way, that boards of governors, whether they sit in England or the United States, they do important work for universities in Israel, let's not be naive about it, but I'm glad to say they have no influence whatsoever on the academic appointments or hirings or firings of any universities in Israel.
Just explain what it was you had done that brought on that attack.
I appeared for about 20 on the Dispatches programme, which, and I'm not trying to be self-apologetic here, which I'd been told was about something completely different, and for the 20 seconds I appeared on it, I was extremely critical of the way that BICOM represents Israel as Israel's only lobby in Britain, and my main argument was that if, as I was told, that that the main underwriter and funder of BICOM is the same person who funds some major commercial centres in the West Bank, I suggested that maybe that BICOM is not a very balanced representative or lobby of Israel. The programme will agree that's all I appeared on, But nevertheless, that's the response that I got.
This was the program about, it's called Inside Britain's Secret Israel.
Now, what was very interesting as a result of it was 120 professors in my university, from the far right to the far left, were so offended by these emails coming in from someone who is a member of the Board of Governors of that university. They wrote to the heads of the university and the President of the Board of Governors asking for that person to be removed or to apologize, which he stated quite categorically in the press he would not. But what was even more interesting was I decided to, play it a bit, and I reported this to the Community Security Trust in the UK. They then wrote back to me and said, look, we only deal with issues of anti-Semitism, but no doubt if someone had written that to a prominent member of the British Jewish community, we would have reported it to the police, and we strongly recommend that you do so. And because I grew up in this community, and although I've lived in Israel for 30 years, and I'm still, in a sense, in many ways, very much part of this community, I didn't want to take it through more headlines. What I found very disturbing was that not a single member of the various organizations which represent the Jewish community in Britain, many of whom I work with on the anti-boycott issues, even turn around and say, well, we don't agree with what Newman said or where he was, but this sort of language and this sort of behavior is totally irreprehensible. Not a single person has done that, nor has the President of the Board of Governors of my own university. And in other words, when tomorrow or next week at my house, a firebomb is put through their door, as was done to Professor Zeev Sternhal a year ago, these leaders of the community cannot get up and shout about it, because by not closing down on this type of debate and this type of discourse, they are, in a sense, partially responsible for these acts.
Wow. I mean, that's a very, very extreme case. You were on the receiving end of it.
And let me just one other sentence. I write a weekly or bi-weekly column in the Jerusalem Post. There were 3 of us left-wing fig leaves writing for the Jerusalem Post. Naomi Chazan has now been removed, and Gershon Baskin and I had a strong discussion afterwards whether we should continue or not. For the moment, we are continuing. I wrote this week's column on the plane today about last night's demonstration in Sheikh Jarrah. I wake up Tuesday mornings in Israel, and my inbox is just flooded, not with critical comments or people who want to take me up quite legitimately, with some really nasty hate mail, which tends to come out of Brooklyn, Toronto, and parts of London. I occasionally, when I'm at home, go to a synagogue which is about as right-wing as they come, right-wing and orthodox as they come. Many of these people are my neighbors. They read the Jerusalem Post. They totally disagree with me, but I think to a certain extent, because they and I live in the same context and environment, they argue with me, but they would never dream of using the sort of language that is used by some of the people coming out of parts of North America and Europe.
Well, let's go on directly on that to Daniel. This thing about North America. It's quite true, anybody who's written in this area does notice that a huge source of this flow of email is coming from the United States. It's very, very often people who say, how dare you say these things, you are, and fill in blank, self-hating Jew, and some really hideous stuff relating to the Holocaust. Very, very lurid and physical often in its description. It comes from there. What inhibiting effect does it have on somebody who has the kind of views you do to be in an environment which is very different from the one here, where the prevailing assumptions are, you said this at the beginning, supportive of Israel, but the prevailing Jewish assumptions are often really the center of gravity is further right. Does it mean that actually you're very circumscribed in what you can say before suddenly you're on a list? And you absolutely rightly, Francesca, said practical examples. Tony Jutt, before he very tragically fell sick, he had written a piece in the New York Review of Books saying maybe the two-state solution has run out of road and maybe it will have to be a single state. He was due to speak in a room rented from the Polish consulate. He turned up, suddenly the room booking had been cancelled, and his right to have the meeting effectively was closed down. So it's a very real thing, this, where certain voices are not allowed to be heard. What inhibiting effect is it having, do you think? If I've characterised it correctly.
And I think that the tide is turning in that respect. There is an industry devoted to a very ugly McCarthyite, and obviously that's something that really resonates in the US and with American Jews. There is an entire industry devoted to a very McCarthyite clamping down on the contours, the confines of what constitutes legitimate debate, legitimate criticism, etc. in the US, when it comes to Israel, obviously. Now, I would argue that mainstream Jewish and pro-Israel organizations have been far too willing to put it mildly, go along with or turn a blind eye to, and in some instances be active supporters of that. Let me segue from that into one of my hobby horses, J Street, because that to me was the backdrop, part of the backdrop against which imagine most people have heard of a pro-Israel, pro-peace lobby in the US, not exclusively, but mainly rooted in the Jewish community, where that piece came from. It came from different spaces, if I can continue this. So one was an argument over the political policy space. What constitutes good American policy in terms of America's interests and in terms of Israel's interests vis-a-vis the Middle East? To be the indulger in chief of things like settlement expansion, is that good for Israel? Is that good for the US? A second place it came from was a political activist space. No one was doing effective pro-Israel lobbying on either side using contemporary campaigning techniques, internet sign-ups, internet fundraising, etc. And no one on the pro-peace wing of the pro-Israel was moving political money to candidates as part of their political activity. I won't go into it. It's not an area I'm personally that engaged in. Apparently, the capacity to be a phenomenal philanthropic and political fundraiser is not passed on hereditarily. But this was a space that J Street filled. But the third place where this was coming from was American Jewry is an overwhelmingly community. They voted 78% Barack Obama. Other than the African-American community, they were the most against the Iraq War. And this community felt that its voice on Israel was being dominated by neoconservatives, the right wing of the so-called pro-Israel lobby, and evangelical Christian Zionists of the so-called dispensationalist mold, which means that they have a certain store for us, which is why they want us as Jews to all go and settle in Zion. And
it's not a nice future.
It's not a nice future. Jonathan can go into the detail. It's not happy. And I think what happened was that there was a fertile ground because enough people had said enough, and the calling card was a lot about Jewish values, was a lot about what kind of, this is so un-Jewish, these McCarthyite attacks. And to defend Israel, to be pro-Israel, is to just, lock up in a box and marked anachronistic, not relevant for today. So much of what we carried with us as Jewish ethics and Jewish values and what we've given to the world in terms of universal values, then I'm sorry, that's not good enough. And it's a real effort to try and reintegrate those two and to reappropriate taking a Jewish perspective on things, which I think applies both to the diaspora and in Israel. Be one definition of, well, what's the Jewish line on Palestine? No, sorry, that's not the Jewish line. There's a hell of a lot more to be said for our line. So
even Jewishly?
I would argue very much even Jewishly. I mean, the idea of hugging and wrestling with something is covenantal.
Explain that, because it's a very powerful idea.
Machloket l'shem hashamayim, argument in heaven's name, Jacob wrestling with the idea that you don't just embrace something, you're hugging it, but at the same time you're wrestling with it, you're trying to give your own meaning to it. I would say is quintessentially fundamentally Jewish, and saying there's only one legitimate kosher line when it comes to Israel, I think is the most un-Jewish position imaginable.
Very, very interesting. Thank you. J Street is exactly where I wanted you to take us with that answer, so and particularly because out of that comes exactly the point that Daniel's closed on in that remark there, which is the notion that some people say, despite the fact that he's Jewish, he's quite critical of current Israeli policy. Despite the fact they're Jewish, they have this view of, for example, human rights. Have you got something to say about that, Francesca, specifically coming from the perspective of your own work?
Yeah, probably too much to say, actually, given the time. I mean, I identify hugely with what you said just now, Daniel, but also it was really striking me scenarios that both of you, David and Daniel, were presenting about debate being closed down. I mean, screaming and shouting at each other as Jews, yes, that I recognise, but closing down debate, whatever happened to 2 Jews and 3 opinions? Well, you know, I work in human rights in the UK, and whenever I'm in a room, at a meeting, at a conference, I'm always doing what my parents brought me up to do. You know, I'm looking around thinking, he's Jewish, she's got a Jewish mother, I'm sure she's got a Jewish father. You know, and I'm never let down. You know, we're so disproportionately represented in the human rights world. You know, frankly, you don't have to be Jewish to work in human rights, but it does help. And why? Because all of us, I know, even if we never ever discuss it with each other, we've got stories on our shoulders, we've got stories in our heart, in our soul, about dispossession and migration and discrimination and, yes, genocide. And that's what people who work in human rights who are Jewish nearly always take there. But when I look and think about Israel, I look and think about it, yes, as a Jew, but through the prism of human rights, like I would any other state. But I do so with a certain wry knowledge that the whole Jewish story, the motor of the whole Jewish story, the evolution of human rights, they've come together like twins, which is why it is completely, when I read things about, you know, human rights and Israel being completely unconnected with each other. I remember a friend of mine telling me some years ago about medieval European history, something I know remarkably little about. And he said to me, and he's not Jewish, he said to me, you know, you can't understand, Francesca, medieval European history unless you know something about anti-Semitism. And I feel the same way. You cannot understand the story of human rights unless you understand about the Jewish experience. If you think back, the Enlightenment story, you know, right central to that was what they used to call the Jewish question. And very, very quickly, the answer to that Jewish question in the Enlightenment period was, okay, we'll strike a deal. We'll grant individual Jews emancipation, citizenship rights. It varied a bit from country to country, but broadly speaking within Western Europe. And this is a European story. I acknowledge people in this audience who don't come from Europe. I'm telling a European story right now. That was the deal. And after the Holocaust, the whole international human rights framework that people feel so sore about that is now being applied to Israel was not a continuation of the Enlightenment, as many people assume. It was actually a riposte to it. Why? Because of the human rights treaties after the Second World War, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and everything that's come from it. They saw the Enlightenment as having failed, not failed in its totality, but failed in relation to a particular minority, minorities generally, but particularly Jewish people. It had failed. And so the whole discourse was changed from rights being something that states grant to citizens, as rights being something that inure in our humanity as people, all of us. And once you have a sense that there's a whole world, you have a notion of a crime against humanity. Once you have a notion that all people have dignity, you have a notion that all states are held accountable for not treating everyone equally and with fairness and dignity. That's where the whole human rights mechanisms, the laws, the discourse, all of it comes out of Jewish experience. I don't say that too often with my non-Jewish friends because I think it's another Jewish conspiracy and they'll all turn off Jewish rights. And furthermore, René Cassin, one of the main authors of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, was Jewish. He said, fundamentally, let's face it, it's the Hebrew Bible values that have driven the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You know, at the very beginning in the preamble, it talks about barbarous acts that outrage the conscience of mankind. That was the Holocaust. It then goes on to say, every human being endowed with reason and conscience must treat each other with respect. Okay. And René Cassin said, that is thy neighbour as thyself. and we love the stranger because we were strangers once. That's the root of human rights. You don't have to be Jewish to work in human rights, but it does help.
But also it means, and thank you very much. Very good. But it also means if you are pointing up a human rights issue related to Israel-Palestine, you're not saying that despite being Jewish. It would be, in your case, or in your view, all the more reason. Because of everything you've just said. I want to now widen it out to everyone. David, very, very brief. And what I want you to do is address something I did raise at the beginning. You mentioned these examples of silencing, etc. We're not talking about horrible hate mail, etc. Just people disagreeing and calling us nasty names rather than genuinely saying you cannot take part in the debate. I just want to be sure, make sure we're clear on that, and then I'm widening it out. So briefly on this.
I think the two tie in, because one good example is how the human rights debate or discourse is represented by certain groups within Israel. For some, human rights has become a discourse. This is the left, the liberal, the pro-peace, and some of those will throw in, these are the Jewish self-haters because they only care about Palestinians, forgetting, of course, that the reality is that I would even say, thank God, that Israel is a strong state. We are a strong sovereign state. The Palestinians are the weak, and at the moment, the occupied, they don't have a state. Why is it that B'Tselem, for instance, is such a criticized organization by anything from the center-right, when you think of it, what an amazing thing this is, that a society which does face terrorism and does face suicide bombers and faces some awful things is still able within its midst to create a major human rights society which worries about amongst Palestinians. That is something fantastic, and that's something that comes from Jewish tradition. My father was involved, he was an ex-United Synagogue rabbi, and he was involved in the creation of a super organization in Israel 20 years ago called Rabbis for Human Rights. It's one of the few organizations which has Reform and Conservative and Orthodox. Unfortunately, Orthodox are very much in a minority there. But nevertheless, and they, based on basic Jewish values, all very strong Zionists, very strong believers in Israel, but say here in the essence of Jewish values, we human rights for the others, particularly in this first situation in history where we are the strong rather than the weak.
Thank you. Let's take questions. I don't know if we're going to get lights up or microphones. I don't know whether we have them. Do we have microphones? I'm not sure. I can't. Yes, we do. OK, I'm going to take little groups of them. And so, Geraldine, why don't you stop at the lady there? And meanwhile, let's get the microphone there to my good friend Jonathan Hoffman. No event like this would ever be complete without him. So I'm delighted to go to Jonathan. And we'll have Jonathan first and then the lady there. So, Jonathan.
Thanks, Jonathan. Nobody's saying it's illegitimate for Jews to say that Israel shouldn't exist. But what people are saying, and I'm one of them, is that it's rather silly, especially in the diaspora. And I think you have to separate the diaspora from Israel. All sorts of things go on in Israel. People call each other Hitler. 7 Jewish children, for example, which I objected to strongly in this country, was on in Israel. I didn't object at all because Israel is a Jewish Semitism, I think, does not really exist in Israel. But here anti-Semitism does exist. And for people to say, for Jews to say that Israel shouldn't exist, and that is what Jews are saying, there's 2 of them on Guardian Commentaries Free, for example, may even be here tonight, is simply crass because it gives ammunition to our enemies and fuels the type of anti-Semitism which is being shown on Tuesday night at LSE when Ben White is speaking, the man who wrote a book called Israeli Apartheid, A Beginner's Guide, the sort of anti-Semitism which Azam Tamimi is. It's not illegitimate, it's just daft.
OK. Lady there, and then thank you, John. While there were some other hands, there were some hands nearby. Why don't you go to the gentleman there, just there with his hand up, good, yeah, and we'll hear from you.
Yeah. Good evening. I'm coming from Paris, so I apologize for speaking here. But I wanted to say that personally, I feel that all this kind of nationalistic kind of discussion to lead today. Maybe nationalism was very important force and a vehicle structuring the modern state, but today it seems a little bit obsolete. And while helping Ari Folman in Cannes to advocate for his film, also with Bashir, there were some very vehement Iranian journalists, and I had to answer them and tell them that if they just put away the idea of killing us in national kind of discussions, and if we moved forward in cooperating in more modern sustainable development schemes like environmental technologies or trade around the Mediterranean.
Can you come to a question? Come to a question if you can.
Yes, maybe we'll be better off. So I don't know what you think about it.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to you, and then we've got some. If you bring the microphone to the man in the second row here, keep your hand up so she sees you, and we'll hear from you. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, I wonder about the use of this term apartheid in relation to Israel and the occupied territories, because I know that it sends shivers down the spine of many Jews, and it has with me myself. Until I was a volunteer in the occupied territories last summer, and I've reluctantly had to change my mind on this, and I do think that in some ways the term apartheid is appropriate in terms of some of the things that I saw going on.
Just explain, when you say volunteer, what kind of volunteer?
I was a teacher. I'm an English teacher. I went to an organisation. I went to a small village in on the other side of the separation wall near Jerusalem.
A Palestinian village.
A Palestinian,
yeah.
Yes. And I was very open about being Jewish.
Sure.
I had very positive, friendly relations. But I did see a lot of things.
Thank you very much. No, that's a very good, practical, tangible question. So thank you. Let's take this one here, and then we're going to come bring it back to the panel. Yeah.
Am I right that the adoption of the Goldstone Report by the United Nations is the first time from an Arab organisation against Israel has ever been criticised by the United Nations, and in that case, is not the Goldstone Report ultimately a pro-Zionist report?
Inventive and creative. I thank you for that question. That's excellent. Let's start with this one about apartheid, because it goes right. It comes up often in this legitimacy, illegitimate discussion. So many people thinking it's sort of across the line to compare Israel to apartheid South Africa. You're trying to delegitimize it, etc. People say that. I noticed Ehud Barak very recently apartheid. Daniel, just tell us what your view is of that particular question, which was brought up by the questioner over there.
It is very difficult to address in the light of what Defence Minister Barak said a month ago in Herzliya. Well, to a certain extent, I think it's been misreported. He said in Hebrew, as long as there is a situation where there is one political entity in all of the area between Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea, then ... And either the Palestinians are denied political rights or they're given a vote, in which case it's either a binational state or apartheid. I'm sure he would say that's not what I meant. Because in the past, Israeli leaders of the center, obviously in making the demo for deoccupation, have said, if we don't do deoccupation is my term, not one that they've necessarily used, for having two states, then there will be an apartheid reality, and Ehud Olmert used to refer to this. Again, as you said, Jonathan, you said there's a very different context. You didn't ask that question, you asked a different question.
I wanted to get on to
There's a very different context to the discussion taking place in Israel and outside Israel, but we live in a rather transparent world. So you can watch the Herzliya debates live and you can read them in translation a few hours later. Look, I think using the apartheid word, first of all, it's not, I'm going to be blunt here, it's not so easy to dismiss. When Desmond Tutu and other key anti-apartheid activists, leaders of the liberation struggle in South Africa, and you didn't give us your name, but like you, they've seen the reality. And someone like Tutu has said it's worse. In terms of the reality inside the West Bank, that is not an easy thing for us to respond to, especially when you couple it with the statements made by Israeli leaders. Personally, I don't think any two situations are exactly the same. That doesn't matter. One uses language across things. I think using the word apartheid closes down debate. It certainly closes down debate for Israel and Jewish community. I also think it's mainly being used as the spearhead of the BDS movement.
Which is? The
boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. Now, I have real dilemmas when it comes to how to treat things beyond the green line. I draw my personal red line at the green line in terms of stuff to do with the settlements. The BDS movement is not about drawing that distinction. The BDS movement is about everything from Israel is illegally boycotted. And I think that's an effort not to say end the occupation we can practically deal with an Israel alongside a dignified outcome for the Palestinians. That's an attempt to say there's no place for Israel, full stop. And I'd say by going the apartheid route, you're also taking a position on what the outcome is, which is a one-state outcome, as was the case in South Africa. So I think it's unhelpful in terms of moving forward a conversation on what needs to happen in Israel-Palestine.
Okay, I know you've got other chances. David, I know you'll probably also want to get into that issue, but I'd rather you just tackle in more detail the question that came from Jonathan Hoffman of the Zionist Federation. I just want to partly remind people, but it's also this notion, because you've operated in both societies, are there different obligations on people debating Israel inside Britain, given that there is anti-Semitism here, and those burdens are not on you when you're sitting in Israel, and maybe in some ways not on you when you're sitting in America, but they are here. Yes. Yeah.
No, but I think Jonathan raises a very important issue of where, between being anti-Israel and being anti-Semitic, where do they interface, where do they touch upon each other, where are they blurred, but where also do we, in my view, mistakenly use anti-Semitism as a means of closing down the debate on Israel, because we're not always capable of dealing with criticism of Israel, which we have to deal with. And I see that over the past few years when I've been very involved for a period of time actually representing Israel's universities here and speaking to principals throughout universities here. And that is to say, there's no question. Let me make 2 points on this. One is to say, clearly, there's a difference between now and the period I grew up 30 years ago or 40 years ago in North London, in sort of the Stamford Hill and later the Barnet areas. There's no question that there is an increase in reported incidents of anti-Semitism in Britain, and that today a lot of the debate around anti-Semitism is tied in with Israel where it never used to be. On the other hand, I think the idea of always, whenever there's an anti-Israel comment, to come out and say, this is anti-Semitism, is an own goal. But there are people out there who do it, and I come across them, because what happens is, I speak to a lot of my academic peers in universities here who are very critical of Israel, who are overtly critical of Israel in my view, who don't know enough facts and information about the good and the bad of Israel in my view. But once they're pushed into that corner and then been told, well, they're just a group of anti-Semites, it's difficult to engage with them. But you can engage with people. You can have a civilized discourse. Not everybody, thank God, is Azam Tamimi. And I think the lines here are blurred, and I think we have to sometimes stand back and say, we need to have a serious discussion and debate about the rights and the wrongs of Israel from different political perspectives, and not automatically associate everything with anti-Semitism, even though I don't want to be naive and say there isn't a growth of anti-Semitism in it.
Since you're on this specific point, do you have in your head, which perhaps you might share with us, but that you use a kind of working distinction between anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism? Because you said they sometimes touch, it's blurred, but can you help us with a line which says, you know, if people say this, it's one thing, but if people say or do that, it's the other?
I think it's very hard to have a categoric working definition, because I think people come at you with different levels of knowledge and different levels of information. What I do find is the difference in the sort of debates that take place, particularly on campuses, which are pro-Zionists or anti-Zionists or pro-Palestinians, who come to sell a political point and become very polemical and then get involved in the sort of heated discussions and demonstrations, as opposed to the tens and if not hundreds of lectures and seminars which are going on with Israeli and Palestinian academics, which are taking place in a very civilized atmosphere, but they're not reported about because they don't raise the issue of someone being called a Jewish self-hate or someone being called... And I think people on the whole are rational. Not everybody is rational, but people on the whole on campus are rational. They want information and they want to make up their own minds. And when they're faced with politicians or even academics with very set political opinions coming from one side or the other and trying to browbeat people into saying, mine is the only position, mine is the only right position, this is exactly what we're talking about. That is a very anti-Jewish way of talking about knowledge and information.
Okay. I know you want to, but I want to get other people in also, if that's all right, which is just on the point about Goldstone. Our questioner is saying, in a way, there is a criticism that uses Hamas of war crimes, so in a way isn't this a sort of pro-Israel thing, but there is a huge row around Goldstone, sent there by the Human Rights Council of the UN. Just a thought or two on that.
I think your question was, is the Goldstone report a Zionist report? I think that, as I understand it, as I've read, that Judge Goldstone himself considers himself to be a Zionist and has had a position at the Hebrew University. But no, I don't think it's a Zionist. It's a perfect illustration of a human rights report, actually. I think that it's a very misunderstood and caricatured report. They didn't ask the question, they weren't asked to ask the question, should the war have taken place, or even should the rockets have been fought. They were asked to ask the question, given that this war took place, how was it conducted? Did it breach international human rights law and international humanitarian law? And they said there's a lot of prima facie evidence, which there is, I think, that they did. And because there was no cooperating state, unfortunately, the report was not able to give as much weight as it might have to the question of was the force proportional. But given that they were not allowed access to anyone in Israel, and even to the West Bank, I think the report did as well as it could. There are some criticisms of the methodology. You can go into this kind of details. But ultimately, you're absolutely right. I think you picked up on a very important point, which unfortunately some people have closed their ears and eyes so they've not heard and not seen, which is this report says that Hamas, to the civilian population, were guilty of breaches of international human rights law, possibly a crime against humanity, just as the Israeli state was. And you know, this kind of human rights approach is why I was a founding signature of IJV. Jonathan has brought it up several times. I wasn't asked to speak tonight as a member of IJV. It never came up till tonight, but I'm very happy to say that's why I signed it. It's because of the bit in the statement that says, we reclaim the tradition of Jewish support for universal freedoms, human rights and social justice. We have learned from our own history, compel us to speak out. IJV is not a group of people that takes a position on the conflict, doesn't say how it should be resolved. It has a whole range of independent views contained within it. But it does take a human rights perspective, just as the Goldstone report has done. And personally, I felt shame at the way the American ambassador said he was worse, Goldstone, than Ahmadinejad. When Judge
you mean the American ambassador?
It was the Israeli ambassador to America, described him in those terms. When this is someone who is revered and respected throughout the world, he was a chief prosecutor on the Rwandan tribunal, chief prosecutor on the Yugoslavian tribunal, was head of an investigation for de Klerk. Nobody defamed him before. He does this on Israel, and then he has to receive all this abuse.
Okay, let's take another round. Oh, no, sorry, yes. We will get to you. Let's have the microphone ready for this gentleman here, and let's have a microphone ready over there. I don't want to make sure I'm not missing. So the microphone here first, right at the very front, and then to you. Right at the front. Before you start, though, sorry, I wanted everyone in position. Daniel wanted us to chip in with something. Yeah, just further along the row there. Daniel's thought, then you. Yeah.
I do want to add this thought. I think here in the UK, and that's very important, it has to also be important to the state of Israel. And sometimes it really concerns me that the state of Israel instrumentalizes Jewish communities and Jewish leaderships, and those communities and leaderships allow themselves to be instrumentalized in ways that I don't think are good for the community.
Explain instrumentalized for us.
Sorry.
I think you might mean used, but I'm not sure.
Those communities in ways that are self-serving, but are not ultimately, I would argue, in the interest of either the community or of Israel. And I think we need some more courage sometimes on the part of those who purport to be the leaders of a community. And that really worries me, because the responsibility has to be on both sides.
Very interesting. Thank you. Gentlemen's there have been waiting patiently. Yeah.
It's probably my fault, but maybe I misunderstood the title. Forward.
Yeah.
And I was anticipating some opinions about the way forward. Now,
crowd pleasing. Yeah, okay.
many of us here are opposed to the current Israeli government and Israeli policies, but I think we appreciate a terrible situation where they are faced with Hamas, whose charter says Israel will be destroyed and will be replaced by an Islamic State. So what is the way forward when you are confronted with that situation?
Very helpful. Thank you. Thank you very much. As you know, there were many changes between the printing of that little bit of information and the panel that appears before you, and we had to cut our cloth accordingly. But it's a very fair point, and we will ask the question as you framed it. We've got the microphone here, I hope. Yes, you're ready?
Clark. I'm not sure to what extent, sir, you will consider this comment to address your question. First, a brief comment, a brief story.
Very brief.
Then I will end up with a question to the,
really
to the panel.
Yeah. Go on.
Some years ago, a friend of mine sent me an ad, a full-page ad, which had appeared in the New York Times the previous day, which showed two columns. On the left-hand column was all the countries of the United Nations, which were allocated to regions, about 190 of them, I think. And on the right-hand column were all the countries which were not so allocated. And that had one country by the name of Israel. And the question was, is this not the biggest delegitimization imaginable? And my response to him was, if you look very carefully under Israel, you will see in invisible ink one other country, namely Palestine. And when Palestine ceases to be invisible ink and becomes bold ink, Israel, then both Palestine and Israel will move over to the left-hand side of the column. So my question to the panel is, do you not think that the best way to stop the delegitimization of Israel is to legitimate the state of Palestine?
Very interesting. Thank you. And we're going to have to wait to get a microphone to you, but why don't you may even help. Well, no, somebody can see you. If you take the microphone there and get the one to there, and let's have another one from over here while we're waiting. It's over there. Can you see? Wave frantically because she can't see you. Energetically waving. Let's see. Have we got somebody over here? Yes, we have. Yeah. Let's go to you right away while we're waiting. Yeah.
Related to affecting change, if a boycott could affect change, would you be in favour of it? And if the Israeli left has collapsed, does a solution have to be imposed from the outside?
Right. Thank you. Okay. Let's hear this from you, and then we're going to take it back here.
My question's about, we talked a lot about illegitimacy, and I want to bring another I word into the inspiration, because I'm someone in my 30s. I grew up in with lots of friends who were very politically active and very involved in Zionist movements in the 20s around Oslo, seeing Rabin and others as great heroes. And really, what's the panel's advice to hook back into this debate, into the activism, these 30 and 40-something Jews who, in their day jobs and in their political activism, are involved in social justice and human rights issues, but totally ignore Israel and the peace process issues? And that actually as well goes to my friends in Israel. What's your advice on how you inspire these people to get involved and engage in the debate?
Thank you. Well, people have taken the lead from our questioner there and are throwing things forward into what we should do now. So let's really go with that. David, I want you to tackle first. There's a few there that really are up your street. Particularly take on this point of, is it perhaps, in fact, this one might be one as well for Daniel, because given something you said. But, this point about way forward, what can Israel do, given it faces a Hamas charter that doesn't just want to get rid of Israel? In some people's view, it wants to get rid of Jews. That was one of our contributions from there. And then also, if the Israeli left has collapsed and there's no hope from within, maybe there has to be some external intervention from outside.
Two comments about way forward, one relating to this and one to the wider debate. Tony, on this issue, we would agree, because I think, on the whole, the consensus position within the Israeli public, certainly until a year ago, was this very we thought it was a concrete idea, but it really was a very abstract notion, 2 states for 2 people, and we argued, look, here are some very right-wing politicians, Ariel Sharon, who have basically adopted a position which used to be considered the extreme left position, not even the Rabin position, but the Peace Now position of 2 states for 2 people. Sharon evacuated Gaza. Let's go and do more about it. But we have proved to be rather incapable, partly because of the other side, yes, but also because of our own failings into concretizing that thing. One of the things that they tried to do in something that Daniel was very involved in the Geneva Accords, which probably was the nearest to showing some very concrete ways and I think this whole debate about Israel right and Israel wrong and the way you relate to Israel, if and when, we believe in messiahs, so you could even believe that one day peace will happen in the Middle East. That's one very good reason why it's good to believe in the coming of the Messiah. You can believe in many other things. I could even give a football metaphor, but I won't.
Please don't.
But if and when it was to come about, I think the whole debate about Israel changes, because there's no question the world sees Israel today right or wrong, as a country which was the weak and the besieged, but as a country which is basically occupying other people and preventing them from having the same rights that it does. But I want to say one more thing about way forward in a different context, because it's also a way forward about the way we have the debate, and that's what's been a theme running through much of the reason why this session is being held in the first place. I think that the way forward is that we have to recreate, as we've said here, a real Jewish debate where different points of views are legitimate even if we disagree with them. We have to support causes, whether they be of the right or in this case of the left, which promote those ideals and those views. And I think I would say the opposite to what Daniel said. I think that sometimes you're right, Israel instrumentalizes communities, but I think Jewish communities in the Western world have moved very clearly. Their establishment, their representatives, have moved from sort of centre to centre-right, and I think communities and their leadership have to be much more representative of what is going on within the real Jewish communities. There are 500 of you sitting in this, and with one notable exception in the front row here, there is not a single representative of or leader of any major thing called the Board of Deputies or the Jewish Leadership Council in this room, despite the fact that this is part of what is representative of the Jewish world in the diaspora today. So the Jewish community also has to become more representative of the very diverse positions of the pro-Israel but left-of-centre progressive liberal positions, which in my view are growing at grassroots level both in North America and...
Thank you. If you are, incidentally, the leader of one of the Jewish community bodies, and I haven't noticed you, please do stand up and thereby refute what David Newman's just said. Daniel, leave it to you, the question that Tony Klug raised, which was the notion that actually the best way to legitimate Israel again would be to create a legitimate Palestinian state. It goes to a bit to what you were saying before. It's not really about Hasbara, it's about policy. And just react, if you would, to that observation and perhaps the other things you've heard.
First of all, I thought we'd done spectacularly well at almost concluding the evening and sticking to having a debate about a debate. And not getting to the substance of Israel-Palestine.
It's
so,
good to do.
I mean, it almost goes without saying, Tony. Look, I think for some people, there would be deep disappointment if the day arrived when a Palestinian state was established, when there was people that embraced that state, where Israel and Palestine could begin to move forward in dignity, not as best friends, not as a love affair, but having put at least the territorial and the occupants, the real sting of the conflict behind them. I think that there would be a lot of people disappointment because it would make it much more difficult to delegitimize Israel. And so I do...
Oh, you mean critics of Israel?
Yes, I think there are critics of Israel out there for whom it's not about the occupation and it's not about the Palestinians being able to build a future in dignity, and this would be a day of great sorrow for them because the rest of the world would move on. And British trade unions would move on, and British student unions would move on. And it would be the real fringes. You would no longer have traction for the poisonous side of the anti-Israelism, and I think that's saying.
That's very interesting.
Here's, in terms of the way forward, for me, there's a huge disconnect right now between my friends in mainstream, centrist, moderate, pragmatic Israel. Here's the disconnect. They all get it. They know that structurally, to entrench this occupation, Israel will go further and further down a road which erodes Israel's democracy, which is an affront to the Jewish values, and which is an affront to the universal human rights that were born from a Jewish place. And it will no longer be tenable for Jews and non-Jews around the world not to speak up on this issue. They get it. That's Ehud Barak's speech. That's Tzipi Livni's discourse. That's what Ehud Olmert was saying. What's the huge disconnect? The disconnect is between their analysis of the situation and their statement of what we should do about it. Because what you should do about it too often returns to, well, we should go back to negotiations. I know we've been there for 17 years. Maybe this time around it will work. We should try and build confidence. If we remove a few of the 600 obstacles to Palestinian freedom of movement in the West Bank, maybe improve the situation economically and strengthen the so-called moderates in Abbas and Fatah. If it's that serious, if you're the defense minister of Israel and you've reached the conclusion it's 2 states or bust, then you do not give a wink and a nod to settlement expansion. You do not give a wink and a nod to fixing up outposts to electricity grids and building roads there and giving IDF security to those outposts. You say we're going to act. And you say to the international community, no, excuse me, no BS, this Israel wants to get out, we want to deoccupy, we don't think we can move the 500,000 Israelis who are beyond the Green Line. We don't trust the Palestinians to do security. We're not even sure we trust them to do governance. We're not at all sure we can deal with Hamas. But we're ready to go out and we're going to do demonstrative things that prove that. We want you to come in and address our concerns. If we have a security concern, address our security concerns. Maybe NATO's part of the answer. If we have a governance concern, as established as a state, the ultimate political arbiter in Bosnia and senior authority was not a Bosnian. If we are serious about getting out of the territories, then I think we have an international and an Arab and ultimately a Palestinian partner. So let's stop with the Bubameises of the excuses. Because it's fantastic. It's fantastic that every week we can receive in our inbox the latest talking points. We can't do it because of Hamas, or we can't do it because of this or because of that. If to Israel, we have to take responsibility into our own hands, and we have to provide the answers, and we can do it. But here's the dilemma, which is the question in the corner. What about if you begin to, if you're a hypothetical concerned pro-Israel Jew or Israeli, and you've reached the conclusion that 500,000 Israelis living beyond the Green Line, and the Israeli security establishment increasingly being inhabited in its senior echelons, not exclusively, but this is going on, by people who kill the community. And the Israeli security establishment having gotten used to being ubiquitous in the territories, but especially the settlers, mean that no Israeli leader has the capacity to take it on themselves and do this. I'm not saying that's the case, but it really worries me. The settlers are a foreboding obstacle. Maybe in the absence of consequences for maintaining the occupation, if the international community indulges the occupation, it acts as Israel's political leadership from acting. If you were that hypothetical person with that hypothetical concern, you would be in a really difficult situation. Could you say, wait a minute, does that mean the only thing that will make Israel move is if I support branding all goods from the settlements, so we can make a choice whether we're going to buy products from the settlements or not? I'd argue it's an act that legitimizes Green Line Israel. It's not an act that delegitimizes. If you're concerned that Israel can't do this on its own, advocacy message to the outside world, and I'll leave you with that thought. If I may make two very short points.
Very short, because we're over time.
One, Islamists. I'm no fan of Hamas. I have a great problem with Hamas, but we have to be much smarter than we've been until now in terms of understanding the world of political Islam. Hamas is not Al-Qaeda. I won't go into it now. We need to be engaging with Islamists who engage in democracy, who have begun to hint at a willingness to accept two states, and with whom we will continue. But we're going to have to live with them in this region. I would argue that the inspiration of taking a Jewish social justice vision and applying it to the state that carries the name of being a Jewish national home is really one of the clarion calls today. We have to win this struggle for Jewish values and for what Israel is going to be. The Israeli left needs support from the outside. The Israeli left has failed to build a narrative of what it means to be Israeli, what it means to address having a 20% Palestinian Arab minority in Israel, how you can have an inclusive Israel discourse which lives up to the values in Israel's Declaration of Independence. That, to me, is the challenge today. Really one of the key challenges in the Jewish world is reclaiming that Jewish, ethical, moral voice, and taking that struggle to Israel from here and from within Israel. And I really hope people get involved in that.
Very much. Very much. Do you want to say please, isn't it? Yeah. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I let Daniel run on there partly because I think he really was addressing the way forward question we'd had. It was very, very good to hear that. We have run over time. A closing thought, I think this is going to have to be, unfortunately, from Francesca, particularly the young man who did ask about inspiring and how we can get people back to human rights. It feels like it's in your territory.
I hope it's inspiring, and I hope it relates to the way forward. All I can say in 1 minute is to go forward, let's remember our histories, our stories, which probably binds almost everybody in the room. Let's stop treating the human rights framework as if it was a big enterprise to tell the rest of the world how to treat the Jews. And remember, it applies to all of us and to every state. And go out and get my brother Tony Clugg's pamphlet. I was brought up to listen to him on that.
Very, very good. What better closing note than a bit of family nachas? It was fantastic. I know that I first of all want to thank all of you, actually, for being incredibly patient, not standing up while people are speaking, but actually being patient and staying with this debate right to the end. I think we have not only covered the issue of how we can talk about this subject, we did indeed cover how we can move forward. I'm sure you're going to want to join me in thanking not only our host, Jewish Book Week, and also the New Israel Fund, but our three absolutely stellar panelists, Francesca Klug, Daniel Levy, and David Newman. Thank you very much. Gosh.
And thank you very much to Jonathan Friedland for chairing this panel. And I would just like to say that I'm very proud that Jewish Book Week finished with this debate, and I'm very happy about it. And I just have one more thing to say to you is, see you next year.